What we're going to be talking about in this video is the innate immune response. And the innate immune response should be considered sort of a mirror image of the adaptive immune response, where the adaptive immune response is a specific response depending on the actual invading microorganism. So a bacteria and a virus, we're going to have completely different types of, or completely different responses to that. So those are adaptive responses. But the innate response means that we're having a very non-specific response to the immunity. So depending on the microorganism, we're going to have the same response regardless of the microorganism. And it doesn't even have to be a microorganism. We can actually have just simple tissue damage, such as things like a gunshot wound, a stab, a scrape to the knee, and so on and so on. All of these are going to result in a non-specific response to that tissue damage. In our next video, we'll actually talk about adaptive responses, but let's focus particularly on the innate responses in this one. So with the innate responses, our first response is our natural barriers. And our natural barriers are things like our physical barriers, epithelial-derived chemicals, and bacterial-derived chemicals. These physical barriers are our epithelial lining, the turnover of epithelial cells, and washing mechanisms. So when we think of physical barriers, what we're talking about is epithelial cells that join together so tightly that they don't allow invading microorganisms into the body. As these epithelial cells get older, they actually die off and they're replaced by new epithelial cells. And so we call this a cell turnover. But as these cells die off and slough off, they are actually removing bacteria as well. So the actual cell death not only creates new cells and new healthier cells, they also help to remove old cells as well as bacteria, viruses, and invading microorganisms. We also have things that are washing mechanisms, and these washing mechanisms are things like urination, defecation, vomiting, even sweating are all washing organisms. And this is fluid sort of washing over the epithelial lining to remove those invading microorganisms. In addition to the physical barrier that these epithelial cells create, they also create a chemical barrier. And this chemical barrier that these epithelial cells are making are certain proteins or even amino acids that are particularly inhibit the growth of microorganisms. And things like cathelicidins, defensins, and collectins are just a few examples of those chemicals that are created by epithelial cells to defend against invading microorganisms by creating a chemical barrier and a barrier where microorganisms can't necessarily grow as well as they should. They also, in some cases, actually destroy these microorganisms, so that they not only create an inhabitable environment, they also will kill off the cells that don't belong as well. Finally, we get a bacterial-derived chemicals. So we have the physical barriers, our epithelial-derived chemicals, but we also get a bacterial-derived chemicals. That means that certain bacteria are actually good for our body. Things like acidophilus in our digestive system are good for our digestive system because they create ammonia and phenols, which will inhibit bad bacteria from growing within that specific system. And so these bacterial-derived chemicals are the result of a good form of bacteria that is fighting off a bad form of bacteria. In addition to our physical barriers, we also have our inflammatory response. And so we think of the inflammatory response as starting with a chemical mediator. And these chemical mediators are essentially particles of injured cells or signals from an injured cell that initiate the inflammatory response. And these chemical mediators, when they bind to a mast cell, it causes the mast cell to release cytokines, which include histamines, leukotrienes, and prostaglandins, and those will result in dilation of the arterioles, particularly the vasodilation of the arterial side of the capillary bed. And what that does is it allows more blood cells to come into these area or into this area to clean up the damage from the injured cells and clean up the invading microorganisms that might be causing the damage to these injured cells. And so this process that starts with the chemical mediator from an injured cell actually results in vasoactive enzymes from these basophils or mast cells. And a mast cell is just a basophil that is in the tissue, not in the blood. And what they do is cause vasodilation. But the mast cell also works alongside of a eosinophil, and these eosinophils are specifically important for keeping this inflammatory process from affecting the entire body, because as we release these histamines and leukotrienes and prostaglandins, there's nothing that keeps them from going to the next capillary bed or going from one place to the other, aside from the eosinophil that release degradation chemicals into the bloodstream to break down histamines, leukotrienes, and prostaglandins. So essentially what we have is sort of working side by side is the mast cell is releasing things that cause vasodilation, where the eosinophil is releasing degradation chemicals that stop the vasodilation in places where we don't need to have inflammatory process occurring. All because of a chemical mediator that is causing this inflammatory process to occur. Another thing that tends to happen with the inflammatory process is that as we're releasing these vasoactive enzymes, particularly from the mast cell, we get chemotactic factors that are going to bring in new cells. And so what we actually see is, in addition to the vasodilation, we see an increased permeability of these blood cells. So the vessels dilate, and which causes the epithelial cells to stretch and to move away from each other, allowing open spaces for fluid to actually leak out of the capillary bed. So this increases the permeability of the capillary bed, as well as allows neutrophils to emigrate. That means move out of the bloodstream into the tissue. So as the cells vasodilate, they will become more permeable, and they will allow neutrophils to emigrate out of the bloodstream. And this will result in essentially 4 different cardinal signs of inflammation. These are the 4 different signs that tell us that inflammation is occurring, and that is pain caused by chemotactic factors and the vasoactive enzymes, as well as from the vasodilation, the increased permeability. This will all cause pain because this is going to stimulate the nerve endings within that tissue. As we get vasodilation, we're also going to get heat from the increased blood flow to the area. We're going to get redness because of the increased blood flow to the area, as well as the increased red blood cells. We're going to get, or increased white blood cells. We're also going to get red blood cells, so we get heat and redness. And we also get swelling, and the swelling also has to do with the increased capillary permeability, because not only are we bringing more blood cells to the capillary bed, but more fluid is actually leaking out of the capillary bed because of the increased permeability. We get more fluid shifting from the blood vessels into the tissue itself. As well as we get or as well as the neutrophils, because as we get fluid shifting from the vessels to the tissues, we also get neutrophils shifting from the vessels to the tissues. And so our neutrophil shifting from the vessels to the tissue might look something like this, where a neutrophil inside of the blood actually will adhere to the epithelial lining of the cell, called margination. And this margination is simply that the neutrophil sticks to the epithelial lining, and as it moves along, it transmigrates, which means it goes through the epithelial lining until it finally reaches these chemotactic trail, which is the trail from the injured blood vessels. And so we have chemotaxis along that chemotactic trail, and finally phagocytosis. And so the neutrophil goes from inside of the blood vessel to outside of the blood vessel by adhering to the epithelial lining, going through the epithelial lining, following the chemotactic trail, and then finally phagocytizing the microorganism that has invaded the body.